Hello, my name's Steve Mellings from ADISA, and I'm here on the latest ITAD in 15 to discuss a mild disagreement that we're having with a client. And like all things, when people don't agree with us, I actually use it as a learning path. And so I'm delighted to be joined by Josh Beasley and Cody Turner of Early Upgrade, who are the manufacturers of the DataBot solution. And it's the DataBot which we're in a little bit of disagreement about. So, gentlemen, nice to see you today.
Nice to see you too, Steve. Thanks for having us.
And I think before we delve into the details, for anybody who's not familiar with your solution, Josh, maybe you can just talk about a little bit about the DataBot at a high level for those who may not be familiar with it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think all of us in the industry are familiar with the typical destruction technique that most of us are utilizing, which is shredding. And shredding, in many ways is a very secure process as long as you're using the right equipment for the right product. But with shredding, there can be an awful lot of waste. So for the last few years, we've spent time and have invested heavily in developing a solution that allows certifiable destruction of data, first and foremost, because data security is priority number one for everyone in this space. But secondly, allows us to keep harvestable components intact so they can be reused. Because ultimately, the aim and objective of everyone in this space is to maximize reuse wherever possible. So over the last few years, we've developed the DataBot, which is an automated physical destruction robot. And in a nutshell, it's a drill mechanism that's programmed to hit exactly where any data-bearing storage media resides within a device, destroying the storage media, but keeping those other parts intact. It's a method that we've coined targeted physical destruction because we feel the specificity of the tool and the way that it operates is very different to anything else that's out there.
And we're going to draw out on that point, by the way, and thank you for giving it a title because part of the reason we're in slight disagreement is that shredding is viewed as the main approach to data sanitization in a physical sense. But Cody, the approach that you've got is new. So for those of us who want to talk about the technical aspect of DataBot, why is DataBot different than shredding in terms of its accuracy?
Well, with shredding, you're just kind of throwing components into something that makes them slightly smaller. The size you get isn't always really guaranteed, and whether or not they actually hit the chip or destroy the chip also isn't guaranteed. But with the DataBot, what it does is we've mapped out the locations of the components inside the device, and it goes to precisely where they are, goes down to exactly the correct depth, and drills a hole through them. So it's 100%. We've destroyed the component that contains the personal information of the user.
And I think just to explain a little bit of background here, thanks, Cody. We've already tested DataBot. I first saw it, I think it was in Austin, where I saw it on your booth, and a brilliantly engineered, really smart looking product. And I couldn't quite work out what its market was because it was just a drill. And I had really pleasure where you guys asked us to come and verify and test it. So we sent an auditor out to your facility in the States with a whole bunch of phones and tablets to actually test it. And we put a few curveballs in, Cody, if you remember. There were a few unusual devices. What we were amazed at is the smart intelligence behind the DataBot. And it's far more than a drill, in my opinion. That's what everybody focuses on. But in actual fact, the process behind it, the logic, stood up to all of our tests, and it passed what we were looking for at that time, which is, can we recover data? And so we were delighted to actually have the opportunity to play with DataBot as your facility, and delighted actually to certify that it does exactly what you claim it does, Cody. And of course, that leads us to the next engagement, because you came back. Not only had you got a certificate from us saying we couldn't recover data, but you wanted to get a certificate from us which said, can you evidence compliance with IEEE 2883? And this was where we had the mild disagreement, which I'll describe it as. And I think this was where we both entities struggled a bit with the English language, which is not difficult for me, where IEEE actually talks about disintegration. And so you need to look at and define what disintegration means. And what we actually saw, pick it up on your point, Cody, was that your solution was far more accurate than a disintegrator. It was far more targeted. Talk me through, from your perspective, the impact that Databot has on the storage part of a smartphone?
So I believe that by penetrating the silicon dioxide layer, we are corrupting the contents of the chip and rendering them essentially useless. The electrons that were where they used to be, that mapped out the ones and zeros, are no longer there.
And I think this is such a great answer. And I'm going to bring Phil into play in a minute. He's not just here to look pretty, because this is where the disagreement took place. Disintegration implies for me lots of fragmented parts of the NAND cell chip. And your solution is actually talking about impacting the silicon. It's far more detailed. And Josh, this is where we kick in about semantics. Does it meet the definition? Our view was that it did not, whereas your view is that it exceeds the definition. And this is why we've had our mild disagreement.
I think for me, what it comes down to is what is feasibly possible versus what is practically possible on the data recovery side of things. Because like all things in life, possibilities are endless when it comes to getting creative and finding ways to do things. But the question is, when it comes to data reconstruction, how practical is it for somebody to pull data from a chip that's been drilled through? Now, I'm no technical expert on this. I defer to the three of you to really come back to us and challenge this point. But I know we talked about, for example, using microscopes, of which there's a handful in the world, to read cells. Like, to me, it seems almost infeasible to think that that is something that people could use on a mainstream basis to extract data from drilled components. Now, I'm open to being proven wrong on that. And like I say, I defer to you three on a technical front to come back and, tell us what we should and shouldn't be doing. But I'm just trying to make sure that we're being practical and not kind of taking the expectation to a whole new world that is beyond any expectation.
That's a brilliant lead into the fourth person on this call. So Dr. Phil Turner heads up our test laboratory here and has done lots of wonderful things in his career and life. And one of them is to take the role as the threat adversary so that we know, to your point, Josh, when is enough? Well, it depends on capabilities, motivations, and the results from any type of intrusion. Now, Phil, in one of your past lives, you attempted data recovery from NAND cells. Perhaps you can share with us the process that you needed to follow to do that.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Yeah, in a previous life, I've done some work on trying to recover data from a NAND chip that had been broken. In as much as the traditional connectivity to it had been removed, so effectively all of the pins had been removed from the package. And what that then meant is we had to kind of start to employ some of the techniques which would have been normally associated if you decapsulated the device. So decapsulation, for those that don't know, is the process of kind of removing the protective packaging from the NAND flash memory device to expose the bare silicon die for analysis. The protective packaging is usually the epoxy compound encasing the silicon die. And there's a number of ways which this would normally be done. And this could be from chemical etching using acids to remove that packaging, and plasma etching or laser removal, or something almost as simple as a mechanical method like grinding the surface of the chip away to expose the silicon die within. Now, once this has been done, you then have to kind of understand what the silicon die is. In other words, really, what chip has it come from? And then be able to bond to that silicon die to break get the connectivity to the device enclosed. Once that's done, then it's perhaps not the so trivial task of trying to control the device and read data from it. Even though that might sound simple, obtaining data sheets for a physical device when it is intact can be challenging on modern NAND devices. These things are protected by a lot of intellectual property, and the data sheets on these things are released usually under NDA. So there's a number of technical challenges to be able to read the device, even if you could remove it intact. But as the DataBot solution has been explained, it breaks the package by drilling a hole in it. So you could imply that the technique is a bit analogous to grinding the surface of the device away. So DataBot is very precise in its the way it applies its technique. It should drill right through the silicon package. But if that wasn't the case and it only just skimmed the top to expose the silicon, then the kind of decapsulation attacks that I've just described would apply. But this is totally non-trivial. The amount of technical knowledge that you would need to be able to recover data probably starts to put it into the state-sponsored threat actor arena.
Thanks, Phil. And I think what we'll do is just link it back to a point you made, Josh, which I think you introduced the term likelihood. Standards, when they get written, deal in absolutes in certain areas. And when we're talking about data standardization, it's often standards are often written because they want to deal in the worst case scenario. And in this case, I think what we have is a technique, targeted physical destruction, that isn't considered within the current standards, because it A is probably only branded by yourselves, but B, the notion of enough, when is enough, isn't considered when you write standards, because they want it to be IEEE is incinerated, doesn't even acknowledge shred. So what we've just heard from Phil is that even if I want to attack a shredded NAND cell, it's extremely difficult. You have to be extremely technically competent, and you have to be motivated to take that type of attack, bearing in mind you don't know what's on that chip in the first place. Even if you do connect to it, you've got to be able to read it, and that isn't a guarantee. And so our disagreement is actually that we tend to agree, just to turn it round a little bit. The ask was, can you verify compliance with IEEE 2883? And sadly, we couldn't. Where we agree is, do we think that DataBot is more than sufficient to protect data? And the answer is yes. And so the question isn't one necessarily of you can't meet the standard. It's that you actually aren't even included in that standard, in my opinion. And so the solution that you've created and the accuracy that you've proven under multiple tests from us, by the way, this isn't a one-time test. We tested multiple different devices with DataBot, and the accuracy that you've been able to deliver means that a threat adversary, Phil, with your swag bag and thief outfit on, is unlikely to be able to recover data. To your point, Josh, it's an infeasible type of attack when we consider additional countermeasures in a typical ITAD facility. First countermeasure, physical security. I've got to get access to that shredded material. Okay. Second defensive countermeasure, it's anonymized. I don't know where it came from. It could be any of your clients. And the third is it's aggregated. It's in a volume of material at this point. If you consider those additional countermeasures, the likelihood of a threat actor who's as capable and competent as Phil applying themselves to this type of attack is virtually nil, because they'd be inside the facility. They're going to take complete devices. They wouldn't go dumpster diving. And so our disagreement, Josh, I'm going to suggest that it's the wrong disagreement that we're having, because we are in agreement. I believe that the standards in this instance don't include the accuracy that you provide through your DataBot. I believe that the DataBot solution exceeds the requirements in many instances because of the benefits that it offers for component recovery. It's also, may I say, Cody, an extremely well-developed quality product, and the consistency in which it works is much more accurate, much more consistent than a general shred. And so I'm not convinced we're in disagreement, Josh. I think we're actually having the wrong discussion. I think the discussion is that data body is new and it needs to be considered on its merits as opposed to trying to compare it with something which it's not meant to be compared to.
I would agree with that. And I've always felt like we've been aligned with that view. And for me, look, just to kind of circle back on all of this, priority number one for me and everyone in our company is making sure that our customers' data and their customers' data is safeguarded. That's priority one. And we challenge the narrative every day internally to make sure that the innovation we're bringing to the table is prioritizing data security above all else. Like reuse for me is a top priority, but it comes second to data security. You know, look at all the information we have stored within these devices. You've got banking information, medical records. When you're talking about government and national security, imagine the type of threats that could be exposed with improper data sanitization. That is priority number one. What I'm trying to get at with this challenge or this debate that we're having is what constitutes feasible or practical data recovery methods, right? And what is a legitimate threat versus something that is way out in the ether? And therefore, what should we be benchmarking to? And the other thing that I come back to with this is for the last God knows how many years, we've kind of benchmarked shredding with an output of 2 to 10 mil as being the standard. And we've gone from that to now, if you can read data on a cell using a microscope, then it's not compliant. We've kind of gone from one end of the spectrum to the other, in my layman's opinion. So what I'm trying to land on is, what is the true standard we should be aiming for? Are we meeting what we would all agree to be an acceptable standard? And does that work for the industry? Because that's the piece that I'm unclear on. I feel like we're in agreement that the data bot is a really good tool. What I'm trying to get to here is, what should the standard be? I think that's the question we're all asking.
I think what you mentioned there, Josh, is quite right. For ADISA and R2 ITAD standards, we apply risk management. So our destruction techniques are about physical deformation of the storage area. So NAND cells must be impacted. Because we know that the type of attack that we're protecting against is a really, really high-end sophisticated attack. And we also know that if somebody's going to come into play, as I've mentioned previously, to try that type of attack, there are easier processes within the ITAD to go for devices. If I was that motivated to target an ITAD, I'd target your logistics process. Without a shadow of a doubt, that would get me far better results than trying to target the end of it. And so I think this. Go on, Josh.
I'm sorry to cut in, but that type of logistical threat is something that unfortunately happens every single day in our industry. Devices go missing in transit, and it's a very real threat that we're all working very hard to combat. But I agree with you wholeheartedly, Steve. There's a much bigger risk there than there is of somebody taking a device where the chip has been drilled through and reconstructing data.
Yep.
So again, I think it's the standards themselves that we all need greater alignment on, so we can all be working towards something that is feasible and attainable.
Couldn't agree more. I think just from our side, that's why we talk in the way that we do, which is physical deformation to enable greater material recovery, where you're concerned, greater component recovery, which ultimately is where we all want to be, because A, there's money in it, but also B, there's more about sustainability. And we need to be smarter than just chucking devices into a large shredder. We need to be far more sophisticated, in my opinion. So on that note, I'm going to say thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank you, Phil, for taking the role as the threat adversary. It's a very impressive product. I know you're a lot of trade shows, so if people are any of the trade shows, which ones are you doing this year, Josh? Are you booked your places yet?
We've done trade shows galore this year. We're in the planning phase for what we're going to be doing next year, but we're just trying to build awareness. And also with this product, it's not something that we are looking to price people out of. We want to develop this process so the industry can use it across the board, whether that's people deploying this technology within their own facilities or sending product to us for us to process on their behalf. We're really trying to make this mainstream as something for the greater good. So in terms of awareness, we'll be attending trade shows, we'll be pushing information out about it and explaining how we can work with companies to give them access to this technology. So we're excited for what the future holds. I'm hopeful that we'll get to a uniform standard that makes sense for everyone. I'm sure we will. We have enough great minds in this industry to make it happen. So yeah, lots to come in terms of the data bot moving forward.
Fantastic. Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Steve. Thanks, Phil.